Hey everybody, it's Patrick Lovell coming at you on August 28th, 2022. So by raise of hands, who can tell me what anniversary is today? Anyone? Anyone? I'll give you a hint. The anniversary that I'm inferring took place in 1963. How many years ago was that, to those of you who are quick mathematicians? That's right. 59 years ago today, the Reverend Martin Luther King gave probably the speech of history, really, all things considered, on the National Mall, which most of us know is the I Have a Dream speech. And it took place as a result of 250,000 people marching to D.C. to protest on behalf of jobs and civil rights and freedom, quite frankly, from the tyranny of what defined the civil rights era, which of course is Jim Crow. And it lent me and it inspired me to think about really the baseline principle of what it means to be an American. Does anybody know what it means to be an American? How about in one sentence? Sure, people are yelling out to be free, to do what they want, to be responsible to themselves. Whole litany of different sorts of narratives about what the purpose of being an American is. What about the American dream? Anybody want to tell me what the American dream is? Especially in context to Dr. King's speech. What was his dream? Well, his dream was to live true to what we put down on paper, which of course was the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, because the entirety of the stain of slavery was completely antithetical to the whole purpose of the American Revolution. And after 400 years of slavery, which I find very fascinating, the Dr. Martin Luther King basically became Moses. And it was interesting to me always to find out there was like roughly 400 years of slavery. And there was 400 years of slavery in the Old Testament that Moses liberated the Israelites. Of course, that's what the whole mythology of religion or whatever took place. But in either case, I always found that to be somewhat fascinating and potentially inspirational to Dr. King in a way that I have yet to read. So if anybody knows if there's any literature that exists on that corollary, I'd love to see it. But from where I'm coming from, and I'm no Martin Luther King, but for whatever reason, I'm just a guy that went the distance to get the truth that has to elevate above this ocean of madness and lies that we all find ourselves in the midst of. The thing about what took place to spawn, to inspire, to elevate the civil rights movement was a racism that was plainly evident for all to see. It wasn't sort of thought about that Jim Crow had a separate slate of laws for white people and, of course, black people. One was above the law, one was below the law. So after World War II and after African Americans' mighty contribution to the war effort that defeated fascism, it laid the groundwork to overcome Jim Crow. And along came Martin Luther King in 1963. There was a lot of things that took place to lead to that moment. And of course, as we all know, there was a lot that took place after that moment. But what I am calling for on this day, this sacred day, is to heed from all patriots, because we're not confederates, we're patriots, a mass movement demonstration march in Washington, D.C., in front of the Federal Reserve on November 1st, 2022, which is 11/1/22, to elevate we the people's knowledge of the truth above the noise of madness in the misdirection of all things the midterms. Because at the very best, the midterms simply are a choice between putting an end to the gains of MAGA, which would take us to a more thoughtful, maybe accepting version of America that still is controlled by the corruption that I am revealing to you. In 2008, the global economy collapsed because of a massive criminal racket engineered by our financial system, which is called Wall Street, that blew up the world and bankrupted our entire financial system. But what happened was the Federal Reserve, which is supposedly regulated by Congress, at least by way of its creation within the statutes, instead acted independently, pulled a end round in the back room, in the shadows, that ultimately led them to lie to the American people and Congress to pull off a massive, massive bailout to the tune of $29 trillion that went to the financial system that destroyed the world. And this financial system got impunity from the Department of Justice for the crimes they committed. That was the real coup d'etat. It was a shadow sector, dark financial criminal rot that overcame the United States' ability to be what the United States is supposed to be. A country of, by, and for the people, where the rule of law is supreme. In that moment, in that era, all of it fell like a house of cards. Or quite frankly, like Humpty Dumpty, for the analogy that I'll bring full circle. Tens of millions of people got crushed. Tens of millions of people got evicted illegally in illegal foreclosures that courts used illegal documentation schemes played out by servicers and foreclosure firms, which are law firms that were chosen by states to bulldoze all of the, what they called at the time, subprime loans, which were liar's loans, which then got into snafu to everybody. It started off with predatory lending towards minorities, and then it got the entire United States at that time period. And when it all came crashing down, the Federal Reserve and Treasury leapt into action to conceal a meeting with the 13 bankers of the largest financial systems in the United States, in which our Secretary of the Treasury, alongside the head of the Federal Reserve, handed a 3-page demand list to Wall Street that said, you're going to do what we tell you. And of course they all did, because they had no choice, because they fucking bankrupted themselves. And the question is, well, why would they do that? The answers are in the con at www.thecon.tv. It's called control fraud. There's a methodology to it, and the entirety of the con reveals all of the different elements of the crime pipeline that were made possible by several decades of what we call deregulation. We already knew how all of this stuff goes after the Great Depression. We put together the Securities and Exchange Commission and Glass-Steagall and the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 to prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, starting in the 50s and the 60s, Wall Street started to try to want to get rid of regulation to compete with global banks, and they thought that we needed bigger and better. There was more consolidation. Then there was a whole host of different policy changes that came from things like Gramm-Leach-Bliley to the retraction of Glass-Steagall, which was a part of it, and then, of course, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which deregulated derivatives trades, which was the back end of this whole thing. It was one massive criminal pipeline. There was an illusion for racketeers that basically sit in their offices and trade a whole bunch of bullshit fucking sawdust, and they blew up the world. Because decades before, quite frankly, they murdered the golden goose, okay? Just like your life, you got to do everything in balance. If you drink too much, if you smoke too much, if you eat too much, if you listen to guys like Alex Jones too much, you're going to be fucked. You're either going to die of a disease or something is going to rot away your ability to be able to, quite frankly, function in a healthy manner. That's what happened to the greatest experiment of democracy the history of the world has ever seen. And we were legitimately a superpower for a very long time. But ask yourself this: can we be a superpower when the reason we became a superpower was because of the framework that the founders of this country put together to create separation of powers because they did not trust power. They understood absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they created the law. And like any sort of engineering or scaffolding for a building, or the way the engineering goes into making sure a plane flies or a ship floats or a computer runs, you have to have integrity of the system. And in the case of the United States, the law has to be as accountable to those in power as those below the line. So our economic system, our economic engine is presumably capitalism. Like I've told you many times before, capitalism is simply the notion of money making money, but it's really in service of private owners for profit. That works in a lot of ways, especially when there are guardrails. And we have learned this before in our history. The reason we wound up, for example, with trust busting of Teddy Roosevelt, and then ultimately what led to the New Deal, was an era after the Civil War where we had robber barons. We had monopolies. We had the Rockefellers. We had the Carnegies. We had, trying to think of some of the biggest Vanderbilts and so forth, robber barons that got complete control of the way the country functioned. And Teddy Roosevelt, after a wave of labor rights movements, farmer rights, populist movements against finance that bankrupted him because of the railroads, and that era that led to women's suffrage, that led to environmental movements, that led to civil rights movements, okay? That ultimately culminated after the Great Depression, if you will, in FDR's New Deal. After that, we ended up having to prove it all again by defeating mightily fascism. And by doing so, African Americans got a piece of the American dream because they earned it, just like everybody else who fought in wars prior to that era, that earned it, that ultimately got into the political arena and said, no, we're Americans. We're not three-fifths citizens. We fought and died for this country like everybody else. We deserve freedom. We deserve equality. And on that fateful day in August 28th of 1963, it was a culmination of not just the political power that was abused through legal power, particularly in the South above all else, but then ultimately it manifested through what was at that time in 1963 a march for behavior relevant to an economy that makes sense. So that in that particular case, African Americans are trying to fight for opportunity as well, economic opportunity. And they were fighting against systemic racism. And that all culminated in the Reverend Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. We've got to do it again. I think there's one of two directions this goes, considering the insane magnitude of what it is that I'm revealing to you. Literally, tens of millions of Americans were set up and then basically raped by a system of rotting criminality that the professionals refused to do their job. So what do you do with the institutions of integrity, or the institutions that we depend on, such as the Department of Justice, the Federal Reserve, quite frankly, those two on the top of everything else, and of course Congress and the Supreme Court and the rest of the judiciary failed to do their job. Now I got to say this for all of those that are like just aghast at Donald Trump and everything that's on display now because of the Department of Justice is seemingly doing its job for the first time in a long time. And kudos to them for doing what is, quite frankly, child's play. Donald Trump is guilty of everything from control fraud to money laundering, deceptive acts and practices, predation, and a whole host of other crimes like tax evasion, and who else knows what's underneath the hood. I mean, that's just what's in the public record, not to mention, of course, treason that came from this January 6th, what appears to be a Confederate coup d'etat. In most periods of American history, that would be huge. But it's still tiny in comparison to the true coup d'etat that took place in 2009 that I think birthed what appears to me just to be like a comic book strip out of Gotham. I mean, it's a race to the bottom. Donald Trump is everything he appears to be. He's just a rotten two-bit crook that somehow managed to be able to merge with, the new Jim Crow movement, the new Confederacy. They all have the same sort of mentality. Do they care about liberty and justice for all? Of course not. Do they care about corruption? Of course not. You can't support Donald Trump and be against corruption. So we've got a two-pronged battle on our hands, if not war. That's one. But the other is the goddamn corruption from the professional class that betrayed the United States with the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended, which is just simply aristocracy. Now, a word to the wise. I mean, look, there's so much in history that you can learn. There's so much in history that you should learn. And a lot of people probably out there, if you're listening to me, you're like, oh my God, we got to go back to the gold standard. Oh my God, it's fiat currency. Oh my God, we're going to be bankrupt. No, man, the full faith and credit of the United States is dependent upon a lot of factors. A lot of factors that were built over the 246-year era of conquest, quite frankly, of the empire that we created, presumably for liberty and justice for all, and a government of by and for the people, right? We know that we weren't perfect. We never were. It's always a march in order to form a more perfect union. But our courts buried tens of millions of people, and they continue to do it using illegal documentation fabrication, just like Donald Trump tried to steal the election with documentation fabrication with election certifications. Where do you think he learned it? Not to mention he was, guilty of predation, and then he ends up suing Deutsche Bank in 2012 for being a victim of predation. Donald Trump is the perfect expression of the grotesqueness of what we are. But just because some guy's got an Ivy League degree, pinstripe suit, driving around in his freaking, I don't know what, a Lincoln, with a driver with shielded windows and an army of guys behind him that are all yes men and their calculators and their pocketbooks, who meet behind closed doors with guys at the Fed, and they say fancy things about stuff that you can't quite understand because you didn't study or become a PhD in economics. Neither did I. Or you don't have a degree in the law. Neither do I. I just have a college education, an experience, and a career next to power. I've seen these things for years, and I had to go on a 13-year journey to reconfigure my mind to understand what it is that I'm telling you. And what I'm telling you is we live in a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate where the powers that be stole trillions of dollars, looted trillions of dollars, manifested trillions of dollars illegally from a system to save the criminals that fucked everybody, which is called tyranny. So the principle that I asked you, which is the fundamental principle above all else of the United States, is this coupling. If the government, if the people are in fear of the government, it's tyranny. If the government is in fear of the people, it's liberty. I'm calling for a peaceful mass protest to elevate the truth over the sea of lies so that fucking media, who has been toe-licking the son of a bitches for their own purposes, who've lied to us. And I will think about this. Think about all of the professionals that we came to trust, so presumably in media, that are supposed to have some sort of integrity, not to mention the documentary filmmakers and media. Nobody did it. They were all in on covering it up. And imagine, everything's fine with you, and you just sit on the sidelines and watch millions of Americans get crushed from this insane deception because you don't want to go down with the ship. Anybody ever seen the movie Titanic? That's what they did. The rich got the lifeboats, and everybody else had to try to kill each other while trying to survive. That's what this is. We have to spawn a massive movement of truth to purge corruption. My name is Patrick Lovell. I welcome and I implore you, and I just reach out to millions of you to stop letting this happen. Stop being a coward. Stop being weak and fight for liberty and justice for all, with the tools that we have to be able to elevate our voices while there's still time. Because if we don't do this now in a very organized and unprecedented way, we will have no choice later. Onwards and upwards.